This is going to be lecture 2.2, chapter 2, second lecture. All right, in this chapter, we're going to talk about something called balance of power. That is a term that has resonance even today. So look at the PowerPoint or look at page 48 in your book, and you will see that there are approximately four major powers in the Middle East in approximately 1500 BCE. And they are the Egyptian Empire, which you can see goes all the way down, all the way up the Nile River and also into the coastal line of what is today Lebanon, Israel, etc. The second power is in Mesopotamia, all right, or Babylonia, if you will, and that is that red area. The third power is the kingdom of the Mitanni for that period of time, which is Nineveh, Assur, and near what is going to be today Iran, Turkey. And the green is also going to be the Hittites, which we talked about in the first part of the last chapter, a warrior culture, but they had long longevity in Anatolia. And finally, the Greece. If you look over at the red, which is Greece and Crete. As a result of these major powers at that time, sort of like if you could imagine um, between the United States and Russia or the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we often said that was a balance of power. And we divided up the world accordingly. And what is good about that is it was one power balancing the other, therefore, the likelihood of war would be less. Now, the balance of power in the world is perhaps China and the United States. That tension keeps us from fighting. Now, in order to make that balance of power work in the late Bronze Age, approximately 1500 BCE, what happened is there was a kind of globalism, like we have now, transnational networks. And the networks are, of course, each of those territories, civilizations, nations. Some had specific borders and some didn't. But this period was transnational because every one of those civilizations that you see on that page 48 or in your PowerPoint had relationships with the other. They had two kinds of relationships. One was diplomatic, which is where maybe let's imagine, let's just talk off the top of our head for a second. The Egyptian empire and the Mitanni empire, because they bordered on each other, had a peace deal, peace agreements. They traded with each other, or they all traded with each other, and they agreed that 3 times a year they would meet and discuss, the value of their trades, enlisting local fishermen, etc. So diplomacy is where you're always talking from one to the other. So in this transformational or transnational web of alliances and relationships, we generally saw a lot of trade and a lot of diplomacy. This is, of course, the late Bronze Age. During this period, Egypt, like the Hittites, was a conquering state. And the Hittites had also created an empire out of all those disparate city states and the kingdoms in Anatolia. The Assyrians in Mesopotamia, you can see that on your map, were adept at trade and travel. And the Kassites in Babylonia remained a force in economic and also in military relationships. So each of these groups then had their own power base from which to trade and have diplomatic relations with the other. They all wanted to extend their influence toward, if you look at the book, the Mediterranean Sea. Why? Well, you would probably say to me, well, if you look at it, you can see that you could trade with Africa, you could continue to trade with Asia, you might even be able to trade with Europe. But yes, they wanted to be able to reach, I guess, what your book calls the Afro Eurasian world. So that was the desire of all of these Middle Eastern, even the landlocked Middle Eastern areas of Babylonia were to trade, get their items to trade in the Mediterranean. So this area was called the Transnational Age, big on Syria and, I'm sorry, big on trade and diplomacy. Often you'll find, we have found letters written between these leaders. We know that they exchanged lavish gifts with each other, marriage contracts, sort of like King of Thrones, or, they made alliances with each of the countries in terms of marriage, etc. Now, it didn't happen via telegraph, it didn't happen via email. It took months sometimes for the spies or the traders to travel from one area to the other, to meet with the king, to establish a marriage arrangement, to create diplomatic opportunities or trading opportunities. So, transnational trade, therefore, allowed every one of these nations in this network, whether in the sea, by the sea, or in landlocked areas, to create a global economy. Using glass, Egyptians had Canaanite glass, which, if you go to Israel or Egypt today, you'll still see examples of this very beautiful glass they made. Greeks had amulets or pottery and amulets. The people in Canaan or Canaan admired Greek pottery, they admired the wool. So there was an incentive to trade with each other. And also, what could you get from the Far East? Silks, etc. Now, the other thing your book points out is in the coastal town of Ugarit. And if you look at that, you'll see it's in what looks like to be today's Lebanon. There was the center of commerce. When they were going into the Middle East or into that area, they often emerged in Ugarit or Ugarit. And the spoken language of commerce began to be this language called Ugarit or Ugarit. And all of this multiplicity of languages encouraged them to have a simple form of written language, and that became known as Ugarit. And the Ugarit alphabet was about 30 symbols representing the sounds of the consonants. Vowels, e, o, u, had to sort of be inferred. We're going to talk about Ugarit and the languages of that region in a little bit. But that the modern alphabet supposedly has its origins and source in Ugarit and in those 30 characters. The other really positive thing that happens before I go on to the Aegean civilization, the other very positive thing that happens with transnational trade is understanding. Just like with globalization now, there's more understanding about who a European is, who a Middle Eastern is. Of course, America is unique. We have a lot of those cultures in our own country. But at that time, transnational trade, sharing of items from trade, languages, cultures. There was a sharing of culture as, of course, they were creating new economies. So please look again at your PowerPoint and your book to get the import in that region in the 1500s, 1400s of transnational trade. Okay, I want to go now to make a little transition from Babylonia, Anatolia, and Egypt into the Mediterranean basin, what is called the Aegean Sea, Greece, Cyprus, and Crete. The first civilization we know, and by the way, we're going to go back and forth from the Middle East to Greece, and then Middle East to Italy, back and forth, back and forth. And interestingly enough, we are still even doing that. We still have soldiers in the Middle East, even now. So we are still going back and forth, west, east, west, east. Okay. The earliest civilization, the earliest Aegean Mediterranean civilization we know about is called Minoan, Minoan Crete, and that is in Crete and in Mycenaean Greece. So look at your map. You could see that little red thing that is Crete. Knossos is the main tower, and Mycenaean Greece is the other one. What do we know about these? Just from looking at the map, they are on the water. So, unlike Jericho and some other places where they had to build walls around the communities to protect them, probably they built, like in Knossos, a citadel on top of a hill outside of or inside of the town where they could look and make sure there were no enemies approaching from water. So, they are called citadel cultures. And the islands in Minoa and in Greece are craggy, rough. They're totally different than the kinds of terrain and agriculture that you might find in the Middle East. Therefore, what do they grow? What do they have to trade? Well, they often had very wet soil, therefore, they created pottery. They could grow olive trees, which could create oils, fishing, of course. And of course, this is one of the things that is their forte. I also want to say that this is the age that Hesiod describes approximately as the heroic age. This is the age of Odysseus and the Minotaur, and all the mythology that you've probably heard of that originate in Greece and Minoa. We thought for a long time that, the Odyssey and the Minotaur and the things that make up those stories were myths or fables of the Trojan War. We aren't so sure now because there have been some historians and anthropologists that have gotten together and have actually read the Odyssey. And if you haven't even looked at it, it's cool to even look at what it's about. It's about Homer coming home from the Trojan War, how many years it takes him, and his journeys. It's often a parable for young childhood or youth growing up and having many obstacles to confront and then getting home or realizing their true selves. Now, as I was going to say, that there are historians and anthropologists who actually tried to travel the Minoan, the Greek island path of the Odyssey, and they claim it could exist. At any rate, another area in which science, anthropology, and history have converged in the late 1800s, an archaeologist, amateur archaeologist named Heinrich Schliemann, became convinced that those stories about the Odyssey were actually real, not fables. And he found the site of Ilium, which is Troy, near the coast of northwest Anatolia. Look at your map, you can see that. Near the coast, okay, I said near Anatolia. He also identified a lot of the citadels, the towers that were like walls. It allowed the forward-looking army to see if there were enemies coming. He allowed them to, he actually located a lot of the castles, and he allowed himself to imagine that Agamemnon, for example, was in Mycenae, which is in Greece. And then another archaeologist from England took credit for discovering the palace at Knossos in Minoa on the island of Crete. And then they they started to wonder if these travels of the Odyssey weren't true. But to get back to, for our purposes, the civilization of Minoa, there was a king Minos. He became a ruler, and even the ancient Greeks described him as a man, a king who was dominating the whole region. And he was um, according to legend, the man for whom Daedalus, if you know about Daedalus, Daedalus just created the labyrinth for the king. We don't know if that's true, but that's the myth anyway. And as of the 1800s and up till now, we believe there's a good possibility that all of these people, like Daedalus, like Homer, the Odyssey, were actually based on real travel, real pathways to Troy. Now, this civilization in Minoa, where King Minos was king, existed during the Bronze Age, and it was called, there was a settlement in Mycenaean Greece and in Minoa, and this Minoan empire on this craggy island, a group of islands, was called a Minoan thalassocracy. Now, thalassocracy just means a naval power, a sea power. Yes, why do we? That's obvious because they weren't on land primarily. They took control by their navy with ships. They were an empire, a thalassocracy of the sea. And we know that Thucydides, the other great historian of this time, was correct that a very wealthy civilization, the Minoan civilization, began to flourish in approximately 2500. It took about 1,000 years for that civilization to reach the wealth it had during the Bronze Age, approximately 1500. It's interesting, as I pointed out before, and your book does as well, that the citadels, many of them, like in Knossos, many of the ruins still exist because they weren't shattered when the civilizations came tumbling down. They were not attacked. And because of their strategic position, meaning on the water, you could see who was the invading navy, if you will, these areas became very wealthy. They were, hubs of exchange by navy. They were magnets for people coming from all over, including Eurasian ports, Africa, other areas. So the merchants traded with everybody, and including others, more eastern, more northern. The Minoans also had contact with what we would now consider Israel, Lebanon, in the Levant, and in the Nile Delta, because once they could get on land, they could also go down the Nile, and of course they could land right off the coast of the Middle East, so you could see that. Now, the painting that was on the beginning of chapter 2 is a Minoan fresco. We believe it's approximately from 1500, a representation of a bull leaping, painted onto the plaster of a wall in Knossos. The other thing is that in Minoan civilization, we know they developed two different kinds of writing. One was called Linear B, and one was called Linear A. We just call it that. Linear A, we've never been able to translate. Linear B, interestingly enough, was translated by a spy translating German documents in Germany during World War II, and he actually figured out how Linear B worked. It was, if you're interested in language, it's an interesting story. Um, and that is sort of interesting about how we uncovered the translation for Linear B. Okay, so that is our Minoan civilization. Your PowerPoint opens up, or the home page is a Linear B tablet from Kenosis. It looks a lot like cuneiform or a pictograph, but it was a real language that many people could understand. Now let's look at Mycenaean Greece, maybe power number two in that region. Um, in this case, also an Englishman in the 1950s, and John Chadwick, who had gained expertise, as I said, during World War II, who were trained in Greek, trained in Latin. They, cracked enemy codes in Germany, and they were really helpful in decoding both the Minoan and Mycenaean Linear B. And that shows us as well that Indo-European culture became helped to crystallize what is Greek, that Indo-European languages influence Greek culture and Greek languages. Okay. Um, Also, another example in 2015, American archaeologists in Greece, the same place they found Linear B tablets, discovered many tablets filled with that had Linear B written all over them that were fully intact. And so, what we've learned from that is that just a more complete picture of the language. They were buried with bronze, gold, silver, jewelry, mirrors, all beautifully fashioned in Minoan Crete and in Mycenae. We have a new understanding of the crafts and the sort of dynamism of and wealth of that culture in Mycenaean Greece and Minoan Crete. Okay, so we have a pretty good idea of Minoan cultural, religious, and political models. The citadels, which copied the Knossos citadel, were centers of government and palaces for Crete and Greece. They were centers of storage, redistribution of goods, agricultural surpluses, and that's where the records were kept. Because many of the Linear B tablets were found there, we know that this is a symbol of sort of the last symbol and the community symbol of togetherness, the government, and trade. Now, interestingly enough, the ways in which those kingdoms on Crete and Greece were founded, and remember, they traded even with the Hittites, who had chariots and wheels. Couldn't have been horses, the most impractical thing to have on a rocky island. Yet there were evidence of those kinds of trades that had gone on. Of course, they weren't very useful for the those in Crete and those in Greece, but nevertheless, we have evidence that they traded with them. And we understand that Mycenaeans had developed prestige as warriors and mercenaries. They had cultural and army warriors who sold themselves to other islands to fight for them. But there were a king and a war leader for sure on Mycenae and Minoa. So it was a warrior aristocracy, quite wealthy. Now, Mycenaeans also had a political culture, we believe, Mycenaean Greece, which may have given rise to what I tried to save for around the time of the election in this country the next chapter called Demos, or democracy. The urban population that all lived in Knossos, who gathered together in Knossos, was a very vibrant, participatory culture. And we're going to have more of that in Greece next chapter. But before we do, we're going to see, by the way, that all of that in Greece is also going to embrace the culture of Zeus, Poseidon, Dionysus, and later Greeks in their own culture believed that they descended from those gods. And I know you've heard about those myths and mythology. But something weird happens at about, let's say, the end of the 1200s or 13th century BCE. Remember, 13th century is going to mean 1200s. And I have a little section on that which you can look at. There's going to be something mysterious that ends the Bronze Age, the Mycenaean Greek culture, and the Minoan culture. We don't know what it was. Archaeologists and historians, believe it or not, still don't have any sure hypotheses for who these people were. They were warriors. We call them the Sea People. We have a couple hints about who they're going to be, and they end the Bronze Age. That whole culture of Mycenaean Greece, Minoan Crete, is going, all those islands are going to collapse, meaning be burned down, desiccated, poverty stricken by the end of the 13th century. We don't know, as I said, with any certainty what brought on drought, famine, disease, social unrest, but and there's a lot of ideas, but the consequences of this collapse are clear. As I said, drought, and turn the page on 52 or look at your PowerPoint, and you could see everything that was building up in Mycenaean Greece, this dry mountainous country, collapsed. Some people suggest that it was Pharaoh Ramses III around 1176 who collaborated with some of the people who could be on the sea, and that he helped the sea people. Other people suggest that he was also attacked by the sea people but made an alliance. Some believe that the sea peoples were people who came down from Europe or and who just kept going. They were marauders, kept going as they burnt down civilization after civilization until they landed on the coasts, what is now Lebanon, Israel, etc., the coasts of the Mediterranean in the Middle East. But we know that the annihilation of this civilization started in the north. It was probably a whole disruption of the trade routes in the north that caused the utter disintegration of the Aegean civilizations, Mycenaean Greece. And it was a whole disruption of those kingdoms. And we know that those kingdoms, because they couldn't grow much, needed trade in order to survive because of their enormous populations. And when these marauders, the sea people, began to invade their and influence the trade routes, they were no match for them, and they were destroyed. And as I said, what is brought about in all of the Aegean is drought, famine. People were arguing and battling with each other. Many refugees fled the Aegean. They went north, west to Turkey. They went any place they could, to small islands to try to survive. And in the end, the sea peoples, we know, destroyed the Western civilizations that had flourished for over 2,000 years. And the citadels of Mycenaean Greece, which had been populated by, a kind of urban culture because they didn't have agricultural land to grow, just depopulated by something like 90%. And Greece entered a period of cultural and economic isolation for the next approximately 250 years, which brings us to about 900, 800, and the end of the Bronze Age. And we believe many of the marauders who learned something from the island cultures of Greece and Minoa ended up settling on the coast of, the Mediterranean, much of which is now Lebanon, is going to become Phoenicia, Philistia, Phoenicia, and Palestine. So let's keep that in mind as we make our next lecture, since I've already gone 20 minutes, of the early states of the Iron Age, Phoenicia, Philistia, etc., and will begin after the enormous Sea People's destruction. I'm not really going to go into who we believe were the Sea People. Some people say, they were Phoenicians. Some people say they were others, Kassites. We don't know who they were. But I do believe that many of them did end up going on until they got to the western coast of the Middle East. And we'll talk about that and the Semitic cultures that develop in this important chapter in the next lecture.